Hello and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'll share my painting process of creating this beautiful and dreamy scene. Earlier this spring I painted an entire collection of paintings with a common theme, an old wall with a charming old wooden door and a potted plant next to it. It was a huge success and I even sold almost all of them, one being hung on the wall in my home. With this video, I'm starting a new series on the channel where instead of real-time and detailed step-by-step tutorials, I will give you a more general overview of the process. I'll be sharing my thought process, general ideas, and some insights over a sped-up version of the entire creation. This way, you'll learn my approach to deciding on colors and techniques, understanding the overall flow of my work, and gain a broader perspective on the artistic process. Additionally, these videos will offer more flexibility and inspiration, allowing you to apply the concepts to your own unique style and projects. So let's get started. For this painting, I decided to use the method of wetting the back side of the paper before wetting the front. This allows us to work wet and wet for longer, but also keeps the paper super flat, avoiding pooling of water and paint. It also helps keep the paper stuck to the board, so we don't need to use paper tape. I find myself choosing this method more and more recently. I just find it less stressful as I'm not rushing with the first layer. The only downside is that it takes more time for the paper to dry completely, so if you want a finished result in one sitting, you can use paper tape and wet just the front side. Choose whatever works best for you. I'm letting the paper absorb some of the water, and meanwhile I am preparing my colors. For the pink wall I am using Cobalt Violet by Jackson's, and to that I add a little bit of rose and pink quartz by White Nights. And this purple color on my palette is called just 1746 and it's by the Super Granulation series by Supervision. You can absolutely use whatever colors you have available and prefer. After applying water to the back side one last time, I'm flipping the paper and I wet the front side. I'm squeezing some more of that purple onto my palette, and with my flat brush I'm starting to apply the colors. I add a drop of Naples yellow and Bordeaux to the ground to make it warmer and more interesting. I'm adding more pigment around the edges and I'm starting to apply color to the wall. To make the color mixes on the wall even more interesting, I'm adding some orange too. I'm adding more of that rose color to cool it a bit. I just love how this color spreads on the paper. I'm not too precise about the edges between the different elements of the painting. Recently, I adopted this approach where I wet the entire sheet of paper while painting the first layer. If I have any white elements, I use masking fluid to cover them. Besides that, I let the colors flow and lift some of them if needed. This gives me a smooth, uniform look with no hard edges that make the painting look heavy. If your first layer is light enough as it should be, you can always define the edges in the later stages of the process. I start altering the different pinks and purples, making a few strokes with each and then switching to the other. This will give me an interesting wash instead of a plain, boring first layer. I'm adding more purple here where the plant would be to show some shadows. And I continue adding more and more colorful strokes, making the wall complex and interesting. Now it's time for some splatter. With a round brush I'm splattering clean water and it creates this beautiful effect. I wipe the water that has gathered on the sides as it may come back to the paper and ruin the painting. Always keep an eye out for that. Let's now add some turquoise to the painting. I'm adding some color spots on the wall and some splatters. My paper is still wet, so I'll start painting the door. I keep it lighter, knowing that I can always add more color later. I think this is one of the most common beginner mistakes, using too much color in the first layer. This makes the painting heavy and missing airness and contrast. My paper is still wet, so now we'll paint the flagstones. I open a new pan of Potter's Pink. I think it's the perfect color to paint these stones because of its beautiful pink shade, but also because it granulates and will help to emphasize their texture. With a smaller brush, I start coloring the shapes that I drew with a pencil. The color spreads out, but not too much, allowing me to create this soft look. Sometimes I reach for some pink or purple to make the stones more interesting. I strongly suggest that you outline the shapes while sketching, as it can be tricky to make them look realistic despite their uneven shape. Let's now paint the pot. I take thick turquoise from the pan and I start filling the shape with this color. I'm adding a little bit of Naples yellow to make it more interesting and like it's reflecting the light from the ground. I add more and more water while moving to the right as this part is more illuminated. I'm adding more splatters because the previous ones I made are more or less absorbed. Some splatters with purple here to create some shadows. I'm adding some larger spots too. I'm using a large soft brush to make the stones more smooth and their edges softer. You can use this technique to soften different areas of the painting. And lastly, before I leave the painting to dry, I will paint the plant. I'm using Leaf Green by PWC and May Green by White Knight, and I add spots and then splatters with both colors. I need more darkness, so I take some green by White Knight and I add it to the mix. I use this color to add the shadows of the leaves, making the plant more contrasting and realistic. For the flowers of the plant, I'm using Opera and Rose, which are bright enough to pop out against the colorful wall. I use a thick mixture, which allows me to add the spots without the color spreading too much. Make sure to leave some spaces between the spots, try to make them natural. Paint different sizes and switch between thick clusters and a more scattered distribution. I finish with some splatters and now I'll leave it to dry. My painting is now completely dry. In this next stage, I'll define the separate shape, giving more sharpness, definition and contrast to it. I start by mixing turquoise with indigo and I will add some shadows to the pot. You can use any dark blue that you have. First I'm laying the color and then I blend it. I add the shadows on the left side of the pot and gently soften them. Let's now work on the door. I prepare more of that dark blue mix and with that I'm adding shadow to the upper part of the door. I blend it. I'm adding more turquoise to make the door more vibrant. On the right there's a shadow too, so I add it. Next I mix burnt sienna and red ochre on my brush and with that I'll add some brown spots on the door. This will make it look older and more authentic. Now I'm softening the edges with a tan brush. The pot has dried, so I can now go back and add more definition. The door and pot are the main subjects of the painting. Everything else we keep smooth and soft, but here we need to add dimension and details. I'm adding the shadow below the rim and then I make the pot more opaque with some turquoise. I try to keep this decorative line in the middle light. I'll define it by adding some shadows. Now with a small flat brush I'm trying to lift some of the color to make it even lighter. This also helps me smooth the lines, making them straighter and more natural. Some last touches with darker paint and I'm ready to move to the bottom part. Here we also have some shadows, but it's not that dark, so I paint it with turquoise. I try to keep this yellow reflection as it helps me with the realistic and three-dimensional look of the pot. I cannot decide if this is enough definition for the pot without adding shadows around it, so this is going to be my next step. After adding the shadows, the picture will be more complete and I can decide then if I need to work more on it. I'm mixing some of that purple with the colors I have used for the wall, and with that I'll add some shadows around the pot. Here especially it needs to be very dark and you can even change the color a bit. Now let's soften the edges with a damp brush. Before continuing, I will fix the shape a little bit. Adding more shadows here, and I even add some of that color on the pot. This always helps for a more realistic look. In the shadows we don't see sharp edges and detail. Here we have some shadows from the plant, so I'm holding my brush high and I'm trying to make spontaneous and natural strokes. The rim of the pot should be lighter, so I'll try to bring back some highlights by using the lifting technique. I'm adding more shadows on this side, so now the pot is standing out more. And we also need to add shadows to the plant that is inside the pot, so with green I add some tiny spots and strokes. Let's now paint the door's recess. With the same purple and pink mix, I color inside the pencil line. I try to switch between a more pinkish and a more purple mix to make it more interesting and to show that the wall is uneven and old. You can add dark blue or even Payne's gray to the darker areas here. Now I feel my door is somewhat pale, so I'll add another layer for a more saturated and contrasting look. I start by wetting it so that I can work longer and for easier and softer blends. This also helps me with the hard edge between the shadow I just painted and the door. So I start by adding more turquoise. Notice that I'm not covering the entire door, I just add a few strokes. Again with some indigo, I make the shadow stronger. I add some vertical lines with turquoise and finally I'm blending everything with a big soft brush. I wipe the recess with a damp brush to bring it back and separate it from the door. Now let's add some rusty spots with red ochre. This is my favorite part. I'm adding a little bit to the cracks between the planks too. And some splatters. For the rusty spots below, I'm taking some orange too. This will make them brighter. Now let's add some darker spots. You can use sepia or Van Dyke brown or any other dark brown that you have. I'm using Mars brown. By adding spots with different colors, we add more realism and dimension. Also, the more details you add, the more realistic the door will be. Use a small brush for this. By vertically dragging some of the paint, I emphasize the planks and their texture. There is a crack between the door and the wall too, so I add it using a neutral dark color, not too cool and not too warm. Notice that I am not painting a straight line, rather I am adding some spots and brush marks. This helps for a more natural look and it emphasizes the unevenness of the stone wall. At this point I decided the shadow of the recess needed to be darker, now that we added the darker details. Now I'm adding some smudges with pure turquoise. You can try with a brush with a different shape. This way you'll have various brush marks and the door will look more natural. Make sure to use thicker paint, otherwise you won't get these dry brush markings. With a clean and damp brush, I will do some fine work on the pot. I will try to lift some of the colors here on the right side and will also try to bring some highlights. Don't use white gouache, the effect will be different and much less convincing. This technique works differently with different colors and pigments, so you might get different results. With time, you will learn which of your colors lift easily. Using the same technique, I'll work around the door, smoothing the edges. I've been more and more into smooth edges recently. If you think about it, the sharp edges that we get when we paint barely exist in the real world. Even if you look at photo references, you will rarely see such razor-sharp edges. So if you want to achieve a realistic look, you should try to replicate that in your paintings. One way is to soften the edges with a damp brush. Another is to paint them wet and wet or with a dry brush. Some final touches on the door with the damp flat brush. And now it's time to paint the plant. First I paint the stem using a liner and burnt umber. I hold the brush vertically and I'm going for natural strokes. I paint some branches peeking behind the leaves too. With some Naples yellow, I'm adding some highlights here and there, making sure not to paint them alongside the entire tree. And finally, with dark brown, like sepia for example, we can add some darker spots here and there. Now I'll use rose and opera to add more tiny flowers. More splatters. What is left now are some final details for the door. I'm using a flat brush and some brown to emphasize the cracks between the planks. Notice that I'm not painting one long perfectly straight line. Instead, I'm touching the brush to the paper and lifting it, leaving some spaces to keep the painting light and airy. Next, I'm dropping darker paint inside those spots. You can even smudge them with your finger. Now the brush is damp and I'm simply gliding it across the paper to connect the separate spots. It's not necessary to be perfect, on the contrary, leaving those lines crooked and uneven will help us show that this door is ancient. I'm adding some smudges with thick turquoise. Now we need to paint the handle. I start by painting an orange circle, leaving a small white for a highlight. I drop some red ochre outside the edges to create dimension. Then I repeat the same with sepia, focusing on the bottom part. I'm blending the colors with a clean damp brush, and with some red ochre I paint a small smudge below the handle. Such smudges and rusty spots help us emphasize the vintage look of the door. I paint more elements with sepia using the dry brush technique. The more elements we add, the more realistic it will look. It doesn't have to be detailed. I add more texture to the door, again using the dry brush technique. With a liner and some very thick leaf green, I'm adding some details to the plant. Just some dots and spots. The same again using pink. If you want, you can also add some white gouache to the pink and use this mix to add brighter details on the plant. Finally, some dots and spots with dark green for more contrast. I decided I want to darken the bottom edge of the painting, so I'm preparing a transparent blue-violet mixture. I apply alongside the bottom edge and I blend it with clean water. This helps us emphasize our focal point and makes the painting more atmospheric. Blotting with a tissue will bring back some of the texture. And this is it, the painting is now finished. I really like how it turned out. Thank you for joining me, I can't wait to see your magical doors. If you post your painting on Instagram, don't forget to tag me so that I won't miss it. If you want more in-depth classes, join me on Skillshare and Udemy. And if you dream of taking your watercolor journey to the next level, consider signing up for a one-on-one session with me. Until the next time!